And so we have great pleasure this evening of welcoming His Lordship, with a hyphen when we say Lord, without a hyphen when one uses your name, right? Malloch-Brown, I read up. So Lord Malloch-Brown with a hyphen has a distinguished career, actually has several distinguished careers. For any of you who are interested in global affairs, this is a name that you will know. I actually certainly knew the name. He worked at The Economist. He worked at the UNHCR. He ran UNDP. Was briefly number 2 at the UN. Was also in the government of Gordon Brown as a state minister. That's where then the hyphen comes from. I think you can hear me, right? Even without the, you can hear me back there, right? Yeah, I think so. Normally, I'm a teacher, so I'm used to projecting my voice. And I just, when I was looking up his biography, I realized that we have one thing in common. We both went to Magdalen College, Cambridge. And actually, when I was looking up your biography, I was reminded of one of the most memorable episodes of Yes, Prime Minister, where Bernard is explaining to Hacker what the various titles mean. So if you look up Lord Malloch-Brown's biography, you'll see that he's KCMG. So what is CMG? It's Call Me God. Actually, it's, Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. And KCMG is Kindly Call Me God. So without further ado, there's also a PC there, which has nothing to do with political correctness, thank God. Oh yes, and one final thing. Anyone, but here this is completely my opinion, and in no way n'engage en aucune façon l'Institut des hautes études commerciales internationales et du développement. Anyone who managed to piss off as well as he did John Bolton is a friend of mine. Without further ado.
Well, I thought you were going to say anybody who managed to piss off John Bolton as much as I did can be offered asylum here in Switzerland. Every time I go into America now, I wonder if my passport's still going to work. Let me just complete what you had to say about these strange British titles, because I'm about to begin by quoting from my old boss, Kofi Annan, whose 80th birthday was the last occasion I was here at the centre. First occasion too, actually, as it happened. But he got something called GCMG. And he said, what's the difference between mine and yours? And I said, Kofi, you're even one grade up from me. Yours stands for God calls me God. So anyway, but I did want to begin the evening just because for many of us in this room who worked with Kofi, it still seems just terribly recent that we lost him. And I want to start with some words that he delivered when, for the first time as UN Secretary General, he spoke to the OAU summit in Harare, Zimbabwe in June 1997. And he outlined in the speech a theme where he talked of Africa going through three waves, the first being decolonization, the second being the period of authoritarian rulers, state breakdown, institutional weakness, the rest that I think many of us remember so well. And then he ushered in his speech the promise of a third wave and said this: the success of the third wave begins with a simple and single proposition: the will of the people. The will of the people meant that became the basis of governmental authority for Africa, he claimed, and then went on to talk about how it was expressed through an increasing respect for democratic practices and for not allowing governments whose leaders were not democratically elected to be recognized by the rest of the continent. It meant much greater respect for human rights and a focus on sustainable development and improving the lives of citizens. And, you know, it all seems terribly unexceptional today, but delivered as it was in Harare, where President Mugabe was already, had been in office for a very long time, and its challenge to a leadership which in much of the continent had been in place for decades, was something which at the time was, I think, rightly considered very, very brave. But he was also putting himself and the UN on the crest of a wave which ran for a good 10 years or so after that for the rest of his Secretary Generalship. And it was the crest of a wave which had begun in the 80s and 90s, where we saw an extraordinary period for Africa and for economic development more widely, a period where, you know, incomes, life expectancy, access to health and education just rose at rates that the world had not seen before. And while the progress in Africa was much less than the dramatic progress in Asia, particularly in China, but also in India and, of course, obviously Southeast Asia, nevertheless, it was a period when there was dramatic progress. And for someone like myself, who was lucky enough for part of that time to be the administrator of UNDP, it was, I think, for myself and all my colleagues, while still, as always with development, a source of great frustration at the things we couldn't do, at the disappointments and setbacks of policies and projects that didn't succeed, it was nevertheless one of the most optimistic periods that we have ever seen, where it really did seem that the statistics were all going the right way. And for someone like myself, whose first extended time in Africa had been quite a lot earlier as a gap year student traveling the length of the continent in 1972, where I had seen that second wave that Kofi had described in his speech of states breaking down, of institutions which simply were falling apart in the immediate post-colonial period. I remember hitchhiking and being picked up by a harried a Zambian official, and he was driving at much too fast a rate in his old Peugeot, and, you know, we fell into talking about why such a hurry. And he was in charge of the Zambian grain board and all his grain warehouses where they were stockpiling grain in the hope of influencing local prices and supply were either leaking or had infestations of different kinds. And you just got this sense, it was for me has lived with me ever since, that example of a state enterprise board which simply wasn't able to sort of meet the challenges of food security for Zambia, or indeed for much of the rest of the region. And it was a period where even at my time at UNDP, we saw, you know, several periods of food shortage across what should have been a grain basket of the southern African countries. And what I also saw in that road trip in 1972 was that there was still a dramatic sort of pattern of light industry and sort of towns rather than cities, with a sort of peri-urban model of settlement across much of southern and East Africa particularly. And one also saw some of the early sort of disputes which still the continent struggles with. I went and hitchhiked to Tanzania, and the farmers around Arusha, white farmers who'd been given land grants immediately after the Second World War. A lot of them were ex-RAF pilots and had built extraordinarily productive farms with several crops a year, and now were being challenged by the new government of President Nyeri over the issue of land reform. So, there was, in a sense, already in 1972, many of the disputes and challenges which were to follow were already laid out. And when it came to that sort of light industry that I saw and the early urbanization, which seemed to offer some prospect of an Africa moving towards industrialization like Asia had, or Europe and the Americas before it, what I had not anticipated and was not evident in the 70s, but which gathered pace at the end of that decade and into the 80s and 90s, was massive economic adjustment programs in the continent, which cut back on unaffordable, unsustainable levels of state spending. But because the state, from my Zambian grain board chief to others, was so dominant in the enterprise and economic activity of the continent, that with that cutback in spending mandated by well-intentioned reformers from the IMF and the World Bank particularly, you saw a huge contraction of useful employment in the non-agricultural sectors of the continent. So, Kofi, when he talked of that third wave, was talking about a new optimism which had been built on the backs of several decades of both economic, political, and institutional failure. But I want to tonight follow my great friend and mentor and patron's metaphor with talking about a fourth wave for the continent. And obviously the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted with such fanfare several years ago by the UN, lay in a way a set of groundwork and ambition for it. They are much more ambitious than Kofi's and my earlier Millennium Development Goals, where we and many of our UN colleagues worked to fashion 8 much simpler goals, which were essentially a social safety net for the poorer parts of the world. Now suddenly here was a 17-goal agenda with a series of anticipated targets beneath them, which collectively amount to an economic transformation, if achieved, for developing countries everywhere, ensuring access to affordable energy and sustainable energy, access to communications, access to not just primary but higher levels of education, the right to employment and jobs, etc., etc. But I want to suggest tonight that just adopting a list of goals probably at this particular juncture in world affairs is not perhaps enough. The MDGs were extraordinarily successful. The most apparently in-your-face absurd goal of halving the proportion of those living in extreme poverty by 2015 was met, to the surprise of many. And it was met not because of huge efforts by the development community alone, but because of economic reforms in China particularly. But there was progress towards it in every region of the world. And as I say, the collective global result was that the goal was achieved. But this next set of goals, because of their complexity and transformational character, it's a much more complicated business achieving them. And, as I reflected on what is already clearly a pattern of falling behind the achievements or the benchmarks necessary to meet them, and as one sees in Africa the mounting expectations on the one hand and the huge big global structural issues bearing down on the continent on the other, one wonders, where are the policy solutions? Where is the innovation? Where are the ideas that are going to allow Africa to achieve these goals? Now, what are the big factors bearing down on the continent? I think it starts with the whole issue of demography. And, you know, a region which is the only region in the world which, because of where it stands on the demographic transition, where there is an expectation of a doubling of the population within the next generation and a half, so that today's population of 1.2 billion will not that long after 2030, certainly by 2050, have reached something like 2.4 or 5 billion. Now, these demographic numbers are always subject to all sorts of revision and such like, and it may well be that as urbanization comes in, that family size may start to come down. But at the moment, there's no reason to anticipate that Africa, which is urbanizing at a much faster rate now than any other part of the world, with a real expectation that we will have gone from 36% of Africans living in cities to something like 50% within the next decade or so. With that kind of rate of urbanization, there is no expectation that there is going to be an ability to build the sort of underpinning of an industrial economy to provide the jobs to support it. Now, what's driving it, in part, a number of factors, but high amongst them, prospective and real climate change, with what we saw as in coming out from the Sahel, when people like myself began our humanitarian and development careers as a desertification problem, now recognized as a much wider climate change problem, which is impacting and has the potential to impact African agriculture much more going forward. The big issues of AI and automation, where there's very little certainty and agreement as to the impact of this on any set of economies. But one of the few sort of near consensus points is that automation is going to hit less skilled economies more severely sooner than it's going to hit skilled economies, and therefore out of Oxford and a few other places have come incredibly high estimates of the impact on current employment in Africa. So it's a period of striking difficulty, potential difficulty for the continent. So how do we make sure that that fourth wave is as good as the third wave and not a reversal, if you like, to the second and first waves of before? And here I want tonight to suggest a partnership of Europe and Africa. And there are, this is not original, it's an obvious partnership. If in terms of geography, the two are aligned, they are a sort of central pillar in a world increasingly organized around an America at one side and a China at the other. And it is proposed at a time when China has been, so both strategic and insistent on investing its way into the continent, or rather lending its way into the continent, with a focus on securing access to resources, securing partners through building out infrastructure, often on very difficult financial terms for the recipient countries, but nevertheless doing what Europeans have simply not been willing to take the political risk and put their money where their mouths is and do. So, a forceful Chinese presence in the continent in gross sort of cumulative terms, still financially smaller than that of Europe or the US, but in year-to-year terms, rapidly catching up. And so what might be the sort of elements of a European strategy to re-engage with Africa? And there is thinking going on about this in Brussels with the Europe-Africa Commission, the team that President Macron has assembled in France of young advisors, many of them of ethnic African backgrounds, is thinking about a very different kind of partnership to those of the past. And, I think it goes without saying that with the history of those three waves I've described, the only kind of partnership which will work this time is one where African governments and countries feel they share the driving seat with with Europe, that this is not, as too often, even now it appears to sometimes be, a European-driven response to migration and some effort to fund governments in Africa to prevent migration flows rather than a development strategy with a broader, longer-term ambition to it. So, I just want to sort of map out how a combination of private capital, public capital and public leadership around agreed objectives and goals could create a, if you like, additional pillar to global affairs between what is in many ways, and this is a broader conversation which I'd be happy to return to in the question and answer period, which is a bipolar world of US at the one end of it and China at the other. But let me just start on the private sector opportunity in the continent. I chaired a business commission of global CEOs, but which had 4 or 5 very high caliber, African CEOs in its number. And the report we did, Better Business, Better World, looked globally at how pursuit of the SDGs could be for business a tremendous private sector business opportunity. And in fact, we looked at 4 sectors across the world. We looked at health delivery, we looked at urbanization and the related infrastructure, we looked at the food chain from production through to retail, and we looked at renewable energy. And when you break out those figures for Africa, we see in the next 20 years, so up to the sort of 2030 date that we are talking about, or just beyond, the opportunity of creating in just those 4 sectors, $1 trillion of business opportunity, which in turn would generate some 80 million jobs. And this was a very serious sort of analytical effort. We had a good, a good team of researchers working on it. And to just give you a sense within those 4 sectors of the examples that they identified, predictably, agriculture amounted to almost 1/3 of the opportunity across the 4 sectors. But for example, within that, forest ecosystems, if there is a $50 price on carbon, could create 100 billion of income for the continent. Low income food markets are an area where there has been simply almost no proper investigation and development. We saw in the extraordinary gains some 57 billion of opportunity in just improving the food waste statistics, and some very simple things to achieve that. In Rwanda, there was an example of just offering basically containers on pallets, plastic and metal ones, to just keep food dry and preserved for a little bit longer. And this saw a 60% cut in food waste and a 30% jump in farmer income. Huge gains to be made for all sectors in improving the nutritional quality of food in Africa. For smallholder farmers, something like 40 billion of gains just through a little bit more smart use of inputs in the farming, possibility of doubling yields, none of it surprising to people who look at the sector. Gains for large farmers too, by better use of big data to predict both weather and market conditions. And we saw examples of how in Nigeria, a country which has seen dramatic improvement in its agricultural sector, which was nowhere a few short years ago, how small innovations a firm called Hello Tractors, which just allows farmers to share tractors, booking it over, over their mobile phones, and therefore not having their capital tied up in the way they would have before, or being forced to rely on non-mechanical means of cultivation. And this kind of innovation, which is very much African entrepreneur-driven, we're seeing, across the continent. Kenya is the most obvious example, with the whole M-Pesa system of mobile banking. Around, 40% plus of the country's GDP now passes through it in one way or another on an annualized basis. But that's spread into other applications like Mkopa, a company that I have been involved in lending to over the years, which provides solar energy solutions for households in East Africa, which along the way offers therefore off-grid power solutions, where literally you pay your lease costs as a user for the solar panel on your roof over your cell phone, and that same cell phone is used to turn it off if you don't pay. But by these kinds of approaches, households in the hundreds of thousands are getting power that they didn't previously have. But, this kind of innovation, important though it is, simply isn't enough alone. And that's where the role of the public sector institutions, of European policymakers working as development capital providers with African governments is so critical, to set the goals of building out an infrastructure fit for purpose for a continent which has this rapid pace of urbanization, which is struggling to provide jobs and services for those living in cities. Across all of this, there is such a big case for partnership, and therefore one comes, in a sense, to the argument, given that obviously there are also major financial implications to it, why would you do it, or why wouldn't you do it? And the why would you do it, I think, is very, very clear, that, in this bipolar world that I've touched on, and growing sort of confrontation and competition between the US and China, there is a massive European interest in reasserting itself, as a counterpoint to both of those. And the adjacent region, which, like it or not, through a shared Mediterranean, is one that Europe cannot but be preoccupied by, is obviously Africa. And the sort of mirror matching opposites in terms of their demographics and economics make them either partners or threats to each other. An aging Europe with a increasingly older workforce, a slowing, flattening economy in terms of growth rates versus other regions of the world. And an Africa full of the demographic dividend of a much younger population, with all the energy and labour cost advantage that brings, but so far not getting its foot firmly on the path of the same kind of industrialization that one has seen in Asia and Latin America. For both sides, there is therefore a great value in a partnership of European capital supplementing that available in Africa itself, of African labour not just being the source of meeting a growing job boom created by that capital in Africa, but also being, in a managed way, very much part of the future of European economies as well. And the contrast, of course, of not engaging around an ambitious agenda of cooperation and development is the kinds of scenes that we've seen in recent years, on the Mediterranean coasts, of, tragic migrant boats, lives being lost, of Europe being exposed at its worst as a continent not generous at times to immigrants, not at all living up to the refugee tradition, which had been so much part of our relatively open political culture of the past, and Africa in a sense, presenting itself as a source of desperation and despair and renewed breakdown, rather than seizing control of its future and building out the kind of economies that all its citizens can be included in and prosper in. And, I still, now some years after I was at the UN, continue to spend a lot of time in Africa. And, when I think of some of the leaders who could be part of this kind of effort that we're talking about, either by their positions or skill sets, there is a remarkable now slate of leaders who are interested in the kinds of issues I'm talking about, of a really ambitious development collaboration. The outgoing president of the African Union, Paul Kagame of Rwanda, who, as some in this room know, is quite a handful. Stephen, where are you? But you may well want to challenge me on this. But President Kagame, who has been the president of the AU, has set in process a reform procedure for the organization. And although he loses his leadership to a less enlightened president in terms of development, President Sisi of Egypt, for the next year, Kagame, remains head of the sort of reform commission for the AU. So there's a real effort to rebuild an AU which is a bit more fit for purpose, and people known, I think, to this institution like Carlos Lopez and Donald Kaberuka and others have been working on that reform package, people who are very good development economists in their own right. The new head of special representative for infrastructure for the continent is a man called Raila Odinga, the perennial opposition candidate for president in Kenya, but an ex-minister of transport and public works in Kenya, who believes powerfully in the idea of infrastructure development. And then people like the new South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, whose early years as a trade unionist and opponent of apartheid have been followed by very successful years as a businessman, and now somebody who really wants to kind of kick up the rate of growth in South Africa and lead an important reform process there. Or individuals like President Adesina of the African Development Bank, who was head of Kofi Annan's Agra Foundation at the beginning, and who in between was the Nigerian Minister of Agriculture, who started a lot of this very rapid growth in that sector. So, there is an Africa today brimming with talent at the leadership level, but actually brimming much more with talent at the sub-leadership level. The young entrepreneurs who've created the kinds of companies that I was mentioning earlier. The young officials who are turning their backs on the corruption and venality of some of the early generations of political leadership in their countries. And you can see whole countries, whether it's Ethiopia or Ghana, stirring themselves to take an ambitious next step in terms of their development activities. So, for me, it's a moment to not just list 17 SDGs and, visit the big atriums of different corporations, which for public relations purposes put them on their walls, or the UN or World Bank who similarly, list these 17 goals as the objectives of what they're doing. Now is a moment for something much bigger and more ambitious, which is real partnerships which have real development objectives in mind, and a real plan to mobilize the capital, a combination of private and public capital to achieve these goals. And as I've said, it's whenever one talks about private capital in the case of development, there's a sort of fear that one's somehow trying to push public capital out or push it to the side. Africa is not savings rich. There is a mighty role for public capital as we go forward in this partnership. But I do, in a sense, in proposing it as a, if you like, a engine block which can then drive SDG achievement, and where others from the World Bank and the whole new set of Chinese sponsored Asian financial institutions can come in as well in a great collaborative venture to build an infrastructure and economy fit for purpose for the continent. As that happens, it happens in a world which desperately needs to chalk up successes, which desperately needs to show that it can find planning solutions which head off climate change, which address issues of artificial intelligence, which respond to the demographic predictions of the future. And, we live in an age which has become extraordinarily short-termist, where the politics of Europe, whether it is Brexit or new governments in Italy or weak governments in Germany, struggle to keep their heads above water day by day, and Britain is no exception to that. Brexit has consumed our politics for the last 2 years. Mrs. May, our Prime Minister, has made one hurried visit to Africa to try and show that she believes in a global Britain post-Europe. But really, none of this meets the need and the occasion of a leadership which, in a sense, responds to the populism, bilateralization of so much of politics and foreign policy in today's world, with a much more structured long-term vision, which delivers for Europe the promise of a stable partner in Africa, and delivers for Africa the promise of prosperity and development for the future. And I think it's around that kind of strategic marriage that the Sustainable Development Goals will be achieved, but also around which we'll be taking care of our children and grandchildren's future. Because, without a little sort of long-term, thoughtful, aspirational, purpose-driven public policy and investment now, there is a real risk that the achievements of the last 30 years of Kofi's third wave descend into a period of, again, state failure and economic policy failure, and this time not just in Africa, but in Europe and beyond as well. Thank you.
For a Q&A, we have about 24 minutes, roughly, let's say half an hour.
Thank you. Do you think that in order to meet Goal 2 on hunger, Africa will need to embrace GMO crops? And do you think to meet Goals 7 and 12 on energy, there will be need to remove energy subsidies?
An expert. On the GMO one, there were several, I lived through it as at UNDP, because there were several food crises in Africa where, GMO crops were volunteered across the sort of international sort of food donor system, and where the presidents of the countries concerned turn the food away, leading to a massive sort of conflict of cultures, attitudes towards GMO foods, etc. And I think that is diminishing in the same way that opposition to GMO foods has somewhat diminished in say parts of Europe as well. But actually, the gap between current levels of food productivity in Africa and what can be achieved with non-GMO solutions strikes me as the first big gap to cover, and that you can renew the debate about GMO down the road, particularly because so much smallholder Africa political economy sort of doesn't like the idea of this massive, continuous, renewed capital investment that GMOs are thought to require versus more traditional crops. So, it seems to me we can safely kick that that argument down the road a bit and work on making a more, a just short of GMO set of resilient seeds, sort of achieve massive productivity gains first. On the energy subsidies, I mean, I think, what's really interesting is if you look at energy in a country even like Kenya, the speed with which, actually solar and hydro and some other things are starting to come into play, not because of government policy, but almost despite it, because it's so much of it is completely off the grid solutions, and so, yeah, I mean, I think you've got to move towards getting the incentives right for energy in Africa, but I think the fact of the big hot sun crouched over the middle of the continent is already driving a lot of change as well anyway.
Thank you.
I don't see any hands. There we go.
I hesitate because I'm just a student. I'm in no way an expert. But could you speak a little bit about some specific concrete steps that governments of countries who benefit from the Nile can take, not only to prepare for the coming food and water insecurity, but also changing migration patterns?
Well, look, the Nile, if we'd been sitting here 6 months ago, we would have been pretty pessimistic about the Nile because, it looked as though there were going to be some pretty serious conflicts around it, and it's, a welcome consequence of the change of leadership in Ethiopia, and, that the Ethiopians and the Egyptians seem to have for now buried the hatchet over this, and, there may well be, the beginnings of a much more sensible regime of water sharing around the river. The may be is emphasis on the may, because this has been a chronic dispute that has run on for a long time, and just this Ethiopian dam is just a new version of it. But look, I mean, I think, if I may, the answer to the agriculture around the Nile is that, the same as the answer to agriculture across the continent, which is, the region is extremely bad at deploying capital and the right African technology, the right agricultural technologies to the right place. Where you have water-fed agriculture, like the Nile, you can afford it to be pretty capital intensive because it can be very, very productive. But it often isn't, because there is, a focus on subsistence farming, because that's what's traditionally been there. And somehow you've got to get the continent in a place where smallholder and large commercial farming can live comfortably beside each other. And, I've been involved in some projects where, for example, you've had a commercial farm and then smallholder farms around it, and the commercial farm has dealt with the milling for the smallholders as well as the commercial farm. And so everybody's income is improved. And, we need to get to a place where there is more rationality about choices on technology and investment, because there's so much politics in land and agriculture, because that's, the history of the continent, that, that as much as the absence of inputs is why we get such a productivity crisis in the sector, in the continent.
Hello, thank you first of all for your talk. I have a question regarding, well, you said for a partnership between, for example, Europe and Africa to bring capital to Africa, to enhance also private engagement. Now we have a situation that capital requires certain institutions, a certain context already to be effective. And for example, with initiatives like under the G20 German presidency with the Compact with Africa, it has basically also that intention to enhance effectiveness of also private capital. But then how can we ensure that capital is not only going to African countries which have already developed a certain institutional context and ignoring, for example, least developed countries where this context does not exist, and thereby in the long term actually increasing the gap between and increasing inequalities within the continent between the least developed countries and those that have more equipped, more capacity institutional context.
So it's a very wise question. I mean, look, the fact is that, you know, if you were to array countries measured on their institutional and economic capacities, performance, etc., and you were then to map that against private sector investment and the sort of the network of public guarantees and risk mitigation steps that public capital can provide through vehicles like the IFC and others to draw in private capital, you would say that the countries with the weaker institutional setups would get more of that sort of public component to the financing program, and that, you know, as countries sort of move up the league table, so to speak, you move more towards, you know, the mix of capital they're getting becomes more pure private sector only. But, you know, what is simple to sit on this stage and describe like that, in truth, has perplexed both the private sector investment community and the officials running public financial institutions for decades. And, you know, there are cultural reasons. The people on the public sector side are terrified of deploying, you know, taxpayer-generated resources behind private sector projects that either fail or seen as only benefiting certain bits of society, or which are seen as choosing one private sector company over another as the vehicle. And on the private sector side, there is this sort of glorious impatience about the procedures and processes that go with public sector investment. You know, they want to do it now, and the IFC takes 6 months or a year before it's done its ESG study, etc., etc. And so, you know, there is for someone like myself who champions private sector funding, but in partnership with the public sector, there's a huge frustration at how, you know, easy it is to talk about it and how obvious the opportunity is, but how pitiful and quite small the real results are, because it's so difficult to get these two things to marry together in a way which really gets the finance, like in the Heineken ad, to the bits that others can't reach.
I have a question, if I may, arrogate the role here as the moderator. You didn't really touch, actually I think you didn't touch at all in the talk about security issues. So as we all know, there's sort of been a major investment by part of the international community in the G5 countries. So, you know, the Sahelian countries, I've been involved with this sort of stuff, and going from, you know, Mauritania, Burkina, Mali, Chad, Niger. Any words of wisdom on security? Because for these countries, which are definitely LDCs, the security issue comes even before. And by the way, I want you in the econ department, because you understand Daron Ashimoglu on the importance of economic institutions, the person who asked the question before.
A very good book it is too. Look, I didn't talk about it only because, you know, in a way, it's a throwback to sort of a legacy of second wave stuff that's still there. And you know, I think, to be honest, you know, the track record is very mixed about what is being achieved there. You know, it seems to me that, you know, there is an attempt to put some slightly improved security capacity on top of some unsolved development problems. And those problems include, you know, the trigger for so much of what went wrong in that group was the forced repatriation of people from Libya after a, you know, rather ridiculous sort of European intervention, which kind of just, you know, sort of destabilized not just the country but the neighborhood as well, compounded by, you know, what is going on now, say in northern Nigeria, with this massive conflict between, you know, settled farming and herder agriculture, with, you know, some very opportunistic people feeding guns to the two sides as part of a strategy to kind of win power at the national level in Nigeria. And so when you see all of this, you know, it's hard not to worry that, you know, while the French in many ways are the best non-African actor at security issues inside the continent, they seem to understand it better than others do. Nevertheless, it's still a band-aid on a problem which really should have a developmental solution. Now, there's a chicken and egg to it. If you don't have security, you don't get development. And so, I mean, I think they're quite right to do what they're trying to do, but it's not going to solve the problem on its own.
Thank you, Mark. I couldn't agree more on the debate you had about the importance of economic institutions going forward. Can I ask a question about something more backward-looking and traditional, and does it have a future? Some years ago, there was a rather provocative book came out with the title of Dead Aid. You haven't mentioned IDA, and what role does that have in this next wave, if any? Or is it, as some would say, something that's abused and we're better off without it? Or does it, in fact, have an important role to play?
I think it still has a very important role to play, and, you know, I felt Dambisa Moyo, the author of Dead Aid, you know, did the sector in some ways a terrible injustice with her book. And, you know, it's in a sense, I think, why it's led people to, in a sense, this bifurcated conversation. You either believe in a private sector and free market solution to the continent, or you believe in an ODA solution. And, you know, in truth, what you really want is a series of presidents, and the one who articulates it most clearly at the moment is Kagame in Rwanda, but you know, Meles used to speak in similar terms in Ethiopia, and I expect the new Prime Minister will as well, which is, you know, an ambition to graduate your country off ODA, that you have a clear ambition that as you move up the development path, you're able to sustainably finance out of your own revenues more and more development services. And as you look at your capital needs, you're increasingly able to get a private sector capital mix which is bigger than the ODA or public finance subsidized portion of it. And so, you know, I think that's the healthy direction that you want countries to go. And I think perhaps the point I should have made was in this commission we did on Better Business, Better World, you know, part of what was driving us was, you know, the thinness and unpredictability of aid flows. You know, that frustration we've all felt when a particular project just sort of runs out of money because the donor's interest has moved on, fashion's changed. Whereas the glorious thing about private sector funded services, even in a region with low-income region, is the service has to be fashioned and provided in a way that either user fees or other income sources generate not just a profit, but the return which allows the provider to go on building the service and expand it and offer it to more people. So, you know, I take as a very good example, I mean, when I was administrator of UNDP, I was a huge supporter of microfinance. We had the year of microfinance, all the rest of it. Then, you know, along come a couple of happy-go-lucky entrepreneurs with M-Pesa, and you know, and the growth of mobile banking has been dramatic. And it's not just the facility of moving money; it's that through managing personal data the way that you wouldn't be allowed to do in you actually know the credit worthiness of those you are lending money to over a cell phone. So, what one's seeing is the private sector bringing innovation to bear on development solutions, not just capital. And so again, it's where you can create these models of partnership. When I said that I had been a supporter of M-Pesa, Mcopa, which uses similar techniques to provide solar power, it was through a foundation. We gave them grant money to get going, but now they're raising money on the private markets. So again, it's trying to get this sort of graduation where there is a critical role for ODA, as the seed funder to get so much going. Even for M-Pesa, Vodafone, when it started M-Pesa, got money from DFID. And I think the other bit to say is that the private sector, always just just through commercial interest, is always going to try and head towards where the wealthier consumer in any market is. And therefore the role of ODA in partnership with local governments to make sure that the poorer consumer is not excluded from health or education services remains absolutely critical. So I'm glad to be able to speak up for ODA, because I do think it is the critical other leg to this.
So in your view, what is the current state of the tension or equation between development and environment in the era of SDG? And would it be possible to strike an optimal balance between environmental sustainability and social and economic achievement or improvement? I have seen local level evidence myself, but I'm not really sure of the possibility of striking the optimal balance at macro level, and some are really doubtful about it. Some experts say it's even an oxymoron. So I'm wondering what you think about this. And second, could there be any African unique developmental model? As far as I know, they try to emulate some model countries in East Asia, for instance. So could there be any ideotypical or model, ideotypical characteristics of African development? Thanks.
Both very good points. The first one, I have to say, and I think anybody in this room who's worked in development would probably agree, it's very puzzling if you've been at the coalface of development. That's actually a bad metaphor, but if you've been in the front line of development,
clean coal.
it's very sort of puzzling to believe that environment and development are somehow at odds with each other, because when you see agricultural productivity for smallholder farmers declining because soil quality is deteriorating, or because they're losing tree cover, or because rivers are getting silted up or polluted, or whatever it is, it's kind of, you just can't get your head around why these two things are seen as somehow trade-offs between each other. But you're completely right, because been around this world long enough to know that there's been this strange yin and yang between environment and development, and at times the international community has raced lemming-like to promote environment almost at the expense of development, and then the other way around. So, just to give you a couple of compass points of this strange phenomenon, the Rio conference, which many would attribute as really launching the modern environmental movement globally. Some say Stockholm did, but very little talk of development in it. Or if you go to the first MDGs, I'm sorry to say, environment was really underplayed. There's a slightly apocryphal story, because I sort of held the pen on the MDGs, about how we almost forgot it altogether. Because it was only goals 7 of the 8, and just, it just simply wasn't integrated into the others in an effective way. So, why does it happen? It happens, I think, because the policymakers and the interests who line up behind the two, come from often from very different places. Environmentalism tends to have a more Western, middle-class, sort of activist base, and that has particularly been, in recent years, true of climate change, which has been very much almost a Western consumption. Oh my God, my real estate in New York is going to get flooded if this goes on, or, and it's been seen rather unfairly as a very sort of Western, sort of middle-class thing. And, development has similarly its own lobbies and groups, and I think it's just completely mad, actually, because, the two are the side of the same coin, and there should be much greater integration between them. To your second question, it's an interesting one, because, Carlos Lopez, who I know has spoken here, and somebody who may or may not have spoken here, Kingsley Magalu, who's a Nigerian academic now running for president of Nigeria, both talk of an African industrialization model. To be honest, I don't see it. I really don't see it. I mean, I think it is going to be, as you suggest, a much more Africa-only kind of development model, with a lot more services, a lot more light industry, and urbanization, which sort of forms around this rather sort of disaggregated, decentralized economy. And that's, partly because the time at which Africa is has embarked on its economic transformation. The world economy is just a different place. Technology has come to bear, globalization has come to bear, and so I just think the opportunity for Africa is going to be very different. And I think the challenge is, can you, in these kinds of entrepreneurship which has produced this mobile phone-based set of services where Africa is genuinely a world leader, and through other stuff in cities, etc., and through a more efficient agriculture outside of cities, are all those things going to be enough to create an employment base, or a sustainable economic base, at least, for the continent as a whole? So I think that that's going to be the challenge. But to those who say, well, it won't be, therefore we need to go the industrialization route, can one really see an era in which old-fashioned, large-scale industrialization provides any kind of solution for any kind of country going forward? I rather doubt it. So I think, perforce, Africa will need to find its own way.
One last question.
Hello. Two questions, if I may, but they're short, perhaps. First one, you referred to the bad era and the second wave of the dictatorships. But I also sense that you admire Paul Kagame, who I also admire greatly. How important do you think is it that Africa has good governance? And will democracy bring good governance? Or perhaps the Lee Kuan Yew type of leader, such as Paul Kagame, might be the route to prosperity, and where can we find those? And secondly, last year, Kofi Annan said, just across the road, on International Peace Day, that the Middle East needs a Westphalia moment. Does Africa need its Westphalia moment? Are the borders fine?
Very good points. I mean, I do admire Paul Kagame, but I don't excuse his aberrations and excesses when it comes to, efforts to consolidate and prolong his rule. But I do think, you've had these self-declared development presidents, if you like Kagame and Meles, the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia. And, for a development person, time spent with them is always bracing and fascinating, because they're really on top of the development agenda of their countries in a way a lot of the sort of more democracy darlings of the West aren't. But, you know, does that mean that I am willing to kind of go with the Lee Kuan Yew model? No, because, you know, I felt very profoundly at the time of the MDGs that we were in some ways trying to make a little bit of a democratic manifesto for poor countries. We were sort of offering things to hold their governments to account by. And where you don't hold governments to account for their delivery on health or education or jobs, they don't do it. And so I've never found a substitute for that kind of democratic accountability. But do I think that democracy in Africa is going to end up where it's ended up in the West? No, I mean, you know, I am so frustrated at the way African regimes have become so sophisticated in gaming elections. You know, the donors are dumb enough they're going to pay for another election in the Congo at the end of this year. Is there any expectation that that election is going to be free and fair? I mean, I don't know. I doubt it. You know, there was clearly significant fraud in the recent Kenyan election. I'm not sure it changed the result. I simply do not believe that the first round of the Zimbabwean election generated the clear winner that was claimed. And so, you know, but we've reached this ridiculous standoff where Western donors expect elections as a condition of aid. Some African leaderships have found ways to, in a sense, you know, honour the principle, but not, or honour the form, but not the content, and are not, you know, are not doing real elections. Yet at the same time, have created a massive cost tax. You know, on, I mean, there have been some astonishing figures of what proportion of government spending has gone into elections in some African countries recently. And, you know, I should declare an interest in, I chair a company that does electronic elections, but we've done very little in Africa because the public procurement around them is just so difficult. You know, you can't win a proper, transparent public procurement in the way that you actually can in Asia or obviously in Europe or North America. So, you know, it's frustrating to see the perversion of this. And so I think you end up in a place where there's got to be democratic accountability, there's got to be a sort of turnover of leadership. And I would argue to President Kagame, you know, look next door at President Museveni. That's what happens if you stay too long. You know, because actually in his early days, Museveni was a development president too. You know, I remember when I was at the World Bank, long arguments with him about, was it going to be education or rural roads? He was consumed by rural roads. You know, he may have been right actually, but, you know, but that's long gone. You know, now it's all about staying in power. So I think that's an issue. On the Westphalia moment, I don't know whether it's exactly a Westphalia moment. I think it's a Westphalia plus Maastricht moment, in that, you know, I think part of what's going on now of the reform to try and create something more like an African single market is key. And I think, you know, if you can just get the economic juices flowing in the continent where you get much greater trade integration, you know, that is going to start solving the issue of the exact allocation of political power between the regional level, the national level, and the subnational level, and between economic and political actors. Because, you know, obviously 48 straitjacketed nations or whatever in sub-Saharan Africa all behaving like individual units is hugely economically inefficient. And yet there is, you know, it seems to me the drive towards a measure, you know, self-rule and self-determination after the colonial period is so great that, you know, you've got to find smart systems of subsidiarity where, you know, you get greater economic integration, but preserve, you know, political control by legitimate representative constellations of ethnic groups and political actors. And along the way, I think there'll be several Westphalias, because I think people will have to learn to live with each other in political formats which are, more integrated than at present.
I'd like to thank you for being at the Institute and thank Lord Malloch-Brown with the hyphen, which is missing on our screen, for his talk.